Given his barbarity so far, what if a vengeful Putin wins in Ukraine? What would happen if Russia were to regroup, dragoon and arm 1 million men, and prevail over even the increasingly well-armed Ukrainian military? Assume Vladimir Putin topples Volodymyr Zelensky and annexes the whole of Ukraine. What would happen to the Ukrainians? We know that at least 16,000 Ukrainian children have been abducted and spirited off to Russia for, we have to assume, assimilation into Putin's captive populations. At least 9,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed by the Russians and more than 15,000 wounded, according to the United Nations, which cautions that the true count is much higher. Catastrophic flooding has resulted from a dam almost certainly blown up by Russia. Countless civilian structures, including apartment buildings, have been targeted by Russian missiles. The Russian indifference to the dangers of conducting war around nuclear power plants has been demonstrated again and again. Of course, Putin also threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons as his invasion bogged down. So Russian war crimes have already been committed and more will undoubtedly come. But if Putin won, after losing tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine's fierce defenders, how would the Russian despot treat Ukraine's population of about 40 million? I fear he might subject them to quasi-enslavement if not genocide. This column is the third in a series about the importance of remembering the terrible past as a way of understanding the present, whether that means combating China's current attempts to memory hole its genocide against the Uyghur ethnic minority or reading about the Civil War to gain perspective on today's divisions among Americans, or about World War II to understand the implications of global threats today. Now I want to turn to what history tells us about how dictators treat subjugated peoples, as a way of showing what the stakes are in Russia's war against Ukraine. We know of monsters ghastly record over the past century. Joseph Stalin killed about 4 million Ukrainians with his forced collectivization of agriculture and the famine it triggered in 1932 to 1933. Adolf Hitler directed the murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in the Holocaust. From 1958 to 1962, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward inflicted the worst mass murder in history, with a death count of about 45 million Chinese. Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia in the 1970s killed 1.7 million people. Other murderous regimes include Bashar al-Assad's in Syria over the past dozen years during a civil war, with the UN estimating a toll of more than 300,000 civilian victims of his bid to retain power. We cannot know what would happen if Putin prevailed in Ukraine, but the barbarity he has already employed is a valuable gauge. Consider that in American law, the idea of reasonable foreseeability is central to assigning liability for disastrous events. Tornadoes are not generally considered foreseeable, and neither are earthquakes. But slip and falls on wet floors in department stores are foreseeable. So is the danger posed by a drunk driver. Liability is hard to assign for acts of God but relatively easy, if expensive to insure against, when disasters are predictable. Foreseeable events can bring judgments of guilt, responsibility, liability for damages or imprisonment. With Putin's character well known and the examples of the past century squarely in front of us, isn't there a reasonable foreseeability that he would embark on a vengeful mass murder campaign if he took Ukraine? Such a horror would not surprise me. It shouldn't surprise anyone if it comes to pass. In the aftermath, politicians and commentators should not be able to plead shock or disgust at what transpired. Putin butchering his defeated foes, hunting down every soldier in the Ukrainian military, all of that and more is predictable. As the Nazis, the Soviets and the Chinese Communist Party have acted, so we must assume Putin would act. Which is why the West must continue to aid Ukraine militarily, with everything short of troops in combat. We know what could follow if Ukraine is defeated. We ought to be repelled by the prospect of complicity. The West must provide the weapons Ukraine needs to survive. Far from being too much to ask, it is the obligation of the civilized world to stop yet another horror from being added to the list of infamies above. Given his barbarity so far, what if a vengeful Putin wins in Ukraine? What would happen if Russia were to regroup, dragoon and arm 1 million men, and prevail over even the increasingly well-armed Ukrainian military. Assume Vladimir Putin topples Volodymyr Zelensky and annexes the whole of Ukraine. What would happen to the Ukrainians? We know that at least 16,000 Ukrainian children have been abducted and spirited off to Israel's incursion into Jenin is a bitter taste of things to come. Last week, a senior Israeli official shared a somber warning with me. Militant Palestinians had taken control of Jenin, and the Israeli army was on the verge of invading the city. He said that neither Israeli nor Palestinian forces had been able to stop the escalating violence there. It was an admission of failure. A few days later, the Israeli military assaulted the city with armored vehicles, drones and rockets, and the latest round in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began. This one, like the previous battles between these adversaries, will almost certainly tighten the knot of suffering without providing more than a temporary lull in fighting. Israel announced late Tuesday that its forces had withdrawn from Jenin. But this could be just the beginning of a continuing cycle of military action and reaction. When it comes to endless wars in the Middle East, nothing rivals the continuous loop of death and destruction between the Israelis and the Palestinians. As a journalist who has covered the recurring violence for more than 40 years, and the iridescent but always unsuccessful peace process, I long ago ran out of hopeful proposals. But here are a few comments about how we got to this latest round. When Israel first conquered the West Bank in the 1967 war, the United States joined other members of the UN Security Council in endorsing Resolution 242. It's worth quoting now, in the shadow of the war in Ukraine, emphasizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war and the need to work for a just and lasting peace in which every state in the area can live in security. The resolution proposed withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. An important historical footnote, which has allowed a generation of Israeli wrangling and Palestinian complaints, the resolution didn't demand withdrawal from all seized territories, just from territories. Israel expanded its occupied territory in the 1973 war. The United Nations responded with Resolution 338, which added a demand that negotiations shall start between the parties concerned under appropriate auspices aimed at establishing a just and durable peace in the Middle East. These UN resolutions spawned a generation of attempts by US presidents and their diplomats to find a settlement. I won't belabor the details, just note the milestones: Jimmy Carter at Camp David, Ronald Reagan's 1982 peace plan, George H.W. Bush at the Madrid Conference, Bill Clinton at Wye River, George W. Bush's near deal with then Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, Barack Obama's stipulation of U.S. parameters for peace, Donald Trump's Abraham Accords and related proposals for Palestinian territories. Each of these U.S. initiatives failed for the same basic reason: neither side was ready to risk the internal strife that would come with real compromise. Palestinian leaders walked away from